The candlelight flickered softly against the marble walls of the apostolic palace, its golden glow painting shadows along the corridors that had once echoed with solemn prayers and sacred processions. But on the night of October 30th, 1501, those hallowed halls bore witness to something far different, something unspeakable, even by the standards of a church already steeped in political corruption. The air inside was heavy with incense and wine. Velvet-draped tables overflowed with roasted meats, honey-drenched pastries, and silver goblets filled to the brim with the finest Tuscan red. Music drifted from the corners of the room, not hymns or solemn psalms, but sultry string melodies that fed a mood of unrestrained indulgence. And seated at the center of it all, dressed in his papal robes trimmed with gold, sat Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, the man who claimed to be the vicar of Christ, now presiding over one of the most obscene spectacles in the history of the Catholic Church. To understand the darkness of that night, one must understand the man. Rodrigo Borgia had not become pope through divine inspiration or pious virtue. He had bought the papacy, not metaphorically, but literally, bribing his way into the highest seat of Christendom with a fortune in gold and a network of power-hungry allies. Born into a powerful Spanish family and nephew to a previous pope, Borgia was no stranger to corruption. His ambition was boundless, his appetite legendary, and his legacy already steeped in scandal long before he ascended to the throne of St. Peter. His reign was not marked by spiritual revival or doctrinal clarity. Instead, it was one of nepotism, violence, lust, and unashamed hedonism. He fathered numerous illegitimate children, elevated them to positions of power, and governed not as a shepherd of souls, but as a monarch whose loyalty was to family and pleasure before faith and God. That night, at the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts, his son Cesar Borgia, equally feared and admired, known for his military cunning and ruthless ambition, served as the orchestrator. The setting was the papal apartments, transformed into a scene reminiscent of a Roman emperor's feast. The finest courtesans in Rome, 50 in total, were summoned to the palace. As the evening descended into debauchery, they were commanded to remove their clothing and crawl across the floor in a grotesque game designed to titillate and shock. Scattered across the polished stone were chestnuts, and the women on hands and knees were made to collect them like animals, while the men, cardinals, nobles, and Borgia allies alike, looked on laughing, drinking, and placing bets. But the debasement did not stop there. The women were then paired with the male guests, and what followed was a display of orgiastic excess that defies even the most depraved imaginations. Cesare offered prizes to those who could perform the most acts of intercourse that night. The reward: silk garments, fine boots, and honor among the morally bankrupt elite. The Pope watched without a hint of shame. Whether he participated directly remains debated, but his presence alone was an unholy endorsement. His blessing had been given to an event that turned the palace of God into a brothel. Eyewitnesses were few, but one account has survived, written by Johann Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies. His diary, methodical and almost clinical in tone, captured the horror in cold detail. Burchard was no outsider. His role was to document Vatican proceedings with precision, and he did not flinch. His words were neither embellished nor dramatized, and that made them all the more damning. There, in plain Latin, he described the chestnuts, the crawling, the coupling, and the prizes. No metaphor, no euphemism, just the truth as it happened. The contradictions of that night are staggering. The Vatican, the spiritual center of 1 billion souls, was desecrated not by invaders or enemies of the Church, but by the Church's highest shepherd. Cardinals sworn to celibacy and chastity cast off their vows like old cloaks. Holy men, once cloaked in reverence, shed all pretense and embraced sin as sport. The sacred was mocked, inverted, and weaponized in service of human vice. The very symbols of Christian morality, humility, purity, self-denial were buried under silk, wine, and sweat. Yet in the context of the Renaissance papacy, perhaps it was not so surprising. The Vatican of the 15th century was as much a political fortress as it was a religious seat. Popes commanded armies, negotiated with kings, and built dynasties. The Church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was the most powerful entity in Europe, and men like Alexander VI treated it as their personal empire. For the Borgias, morality was flexible, faith negotiable, and salvation for sale to the highest bidder. Cesare Borgia, long held as the real-world model for Machiavelli's The Prince, understood power not as a gift from God, but as something to be taken by force, seduction or manipulation. His orchestration of the banquet was a message as much as it was a party. No law, no vow, no divine authority could constrain the will of the Borgia family, but Rome was watching. So were the people of Europe. The tales of Vatican depravity did not stay behind marble walls. They traveled by whisper, by courier, by chronicler. Critics of the Church, reformers and rival monarchs seized upon these stories as proof of corruption in the heart of Christendom. For Martin Luther, who would ignite the Reformation just years later, the Borgia papacy stood as an icon of everything the Church had lost: its humility, its purpose, its soul. After Alexander's death in 1503, Rome breathed a sigh of relief, though his legacy would haunt the papacy for generations. His corpse, it is said, swelled and blackened so grotesquely that even his own clergy recoiled. His enemies called it divine judgment. His supporters fell silent. Cesare, once poised to rule Italy, fell from power and died in obscurity. Lucrezia, whose name had been dragged through the mud of scandal, retreated into noblewoman respectability and died young. The Borgia dynasty, once feared across the continent, faded into infamy, but the memory of the Banquet of Chestnuts did not die. It endured not simply because of its shocking details, but because of what it represented: the corruption of the sacred, the triumph of appetite over restraint, the loss of moral compass within the very institution meant to guide it. It became a symbol, a dark mirror, held up to the face of the Church, forcing it to confront what it had become. In the centuries since, historians have debated the veracity of every detail. Some argue exaggeration, others suggest political propaganda, but even stripped of embellishment, the truth remains damning. A pope sanctioned an orgy, a palace built for prayer became a theater of perversion, and a church entrusted with the care of souls instead bathed in the pleasures of flesh. The Banquet of Chestnuts remains one of the most grotesque chapters in the long and often turbulent history of the Catholic Church. It reminds us that institutions, no matter how sacred, are vulnerable to the corruption of those who lead them. That power, unchallenged and unchecked, can warp the very foundations of morality, and that even in the most revered places on earth, sin can find a throne if no one dares to resist it.